Imagine this: a massive German bomber soaring undetected across the Atlantic, flying so close to New York City that it could see the skyline, then vanishing back into Europe without anyone ever realizing it was there. Sounds like the plot of a thriller, right? But during World War II, rumors spread that this very thing happened. The aircraft in question? The Junkers U-390. Some called it Hitler's secret intercontinental bomber. Others dismissed it as pure propaganda. But here's the real question: could it have actually been possible? The ambition behind it. The year is 1942. The world is on fire. Nazi Germany has conquered vast swaths of Europe, but the tide of war is beginning to shift. The United States has entered the conflict, sending men, machines, and endless supplies across the Atlantic to Britain and the Soviet Union. For Hitler, this was a nightmare. He knew that America's industrial power, if left unchecked, would eventually crush the Reich. So, in the darkest war rooms of Berlin, a radical idea began to take shape. What if Germany could strike at America itself? Not just its ships in the Atlantic, not just its bases in Britain, but the American homeland. A direct blow right to the heart. Imagine bombs falling on New York or Washington. Imagine the panic. Imagine the message it would send: nowhere is safe. It wasn't just about destruction, it was about psychology. A single successful raid could force the United States to divert massive resources away from Europe, building air defenses at home, calming a terrified population, and weakening the Allied front overseas. Hitler and his inner circle believed this kind of shock strike might tilt the balance of the war back in their favor. But there was a problem: distance. New York City was nearly 6,000 kilometers away from Germany. No German aircraft at the time could get close, let alone carry a bomb load across the ocean and return safely. The Luftwaffe had no intercontinental bombers, and designing one from scratch in the middle of a war was almost impossible. Almost. This is where the concept of the Amerika Bomber was born, a program dedicated to building aircraft capable of reaching the United States. Multiple German companies jumped in, each offering their own designs. Messerschmitt pushed the Me-264, Focke-Wulf presented the Ta-400, Heinkel proposed the He-277, but all of them faced daunting technical problems. And then came Junkers. Their idea was clever. Instead of reinventing the wheel, they would take what already worked, the U-290, a transport and reconnaissance plane, and supercharge it. Stretch it, strengthen it, and give it more engines. A Frankenstein creation built not from dreams, but from proven components. And thus, the U-390 was conceived. To the Nazi leadership, it sounded like the perfect solution. A bomber so large and so powerful that it could lift off from Europe, cross the Atlantic, unleash destruction on America's east coast, and return home without ever needing to land or refuel. It was ambitious, delusional, and terrifying all at once. But here's the chilling part. On paper, it actually looked possible. The birth of the U-390. From the outside, the U-390 didn't look like some revolutionary marvel of science fiction. In fact, that was the genius behind it. Junkers didn't start with a blank sheet of paper, they started with something that already worked. The U-290 was a proven design, a sturdy transport aircraft, reliable in reconnaissance, and already stretched to impressive limits. The engineers at Junkers simply asked themselves, what if bigger is better? And so the 290 was reborn as the 390. They didn't try to reinvent aviation, they scaled it up. The fuselage was extended, the wingspan was pushed to jaw-dropping proportions, and instead of 4 engines, they bolted on 6. 6 massive BMW 801E radial engines, each one churning out around 1,700 horsepower. Together, that was more than 10,000 horsepower roaring in unison, enough to lift a house into the sky. The result? A flying behemoth. The U-390 was longer than many modern passenger jets. Its wings stretched over 50 meters, wide enough to cover 2 full tennis courts. It wasn't just big, it was monstrous, a metal colossus designed to cross oceans. Other German companies were in the race too. Messerschmitt's Me-264 had promise, but it was plagued by technical problems. Heinekel's He-277 never got past prototypes. Focke-Wulf's Ta-400 was even more ambitious, but hopelessly impractical. In comparison, the U-390 looked real, achievable. Because unlike the others, it wasn't some fragile experimental fantasy. It was built from tested, reliable parts. Think of it as a Frankenstein flyer. Familiar bones, familiar muscles, but stitched together into something terrifyingly new. That's why when Nazi officials asked who could really deliver the Amerika Bomber, Junkers stood out as the frontrunner. And they weren't just promising a single plane, they envisioned an entire family of aircraft. Transport versions, maritime patrol plans, even a long-range strategic bomber that could strike targets continents away. On paper, it was Germany's ticket to global reach. But as with everything in war, paper promises rarely match reality. The monster specs. The U-390 wasn't just another warplane. It was a giant, an aircraft so big and so ambitious that even today it sounds almost unbelievable. First, its size. The wingspan stretched more than 50 meters, longer than 2 articulated buses parked end-to-end. Its wings were so wide you could lay out 2 tennis courts on them and still have space to spare. The fuselage, as long as a modern regional jet, with enough room inside to carry bombs, troops, or entire vehicles. Seeing it up close must have been surreal, like watching a skyscraper sprout wings.
But raw power always comes at a cost. 6 engines meant 6 times the heat, 6 times the vibration, and 6 times the thirst for fuel. And fuel was something Germany had less and less of as the war dragged on. What made the Ju-390 truly terrifying wasn't just its size or its power, it was its range. On paper, this monster could fly nearly 10,000 kilometers without stopping. In practice, the number was closer to 8,000 kilometers, depending on weight and weather. But even that was enough. From occupied France, the Ju-390 could take off, cross the Atlantic, reach New York City, drop its payload, and still make it home. No mid-air refueling, no pit stops, just one continuous journey across an ocean. And it wasn't a small payload either. This wasn't a plane that would cross the Atlantic just to drop a symbolic stick of dynamite. Fully loaded, the Ju-390 could carry over 10 tons of bombs or cargo. That's more destructive power than the Luftwaffe had ever dreamed of delivering to American soil. Yet for all its strengths, the Ju-390 had critical weaknesses. The bigger a plane gets, the trickier it becomes to fly. Pilots reported that the Ju-390 was stable in the air, yes, steady and predictable, but painfully slow to respond. Maneuvering it was like steering a battleship through the clouds. And then there was the most dangerous moment of all: takeoff. Fully loaded, the Ju-390 needed ridiculously long runways. If even a single engine failed during the climb, the aircraft could spiral into disaster in seconds. It wasn't just a challenge, it was a gamble every time it left the ground. But once airborne, it was something new. Something no other nation in the world had at that time. A true intercontinental bomber. And Germany wasn't content with just one. Defense and offense. Building an aircraft that could fly to New York and back was already insane. But the designers of the Ju-390 didn't stop at range or payload. They wanted it to be both a flying fortress and a flying arsenal. Let's start with defense. The Luftwaffe had learned the hard way that long-range bombers were easy prey if they weren't well protected. The skies over Europe were a graveyard of Allied and Axis bombers, shredded by fighters and anti-aircraft guns. If the Ju-390 was going to travel thousands of kilometers deep into enemy territory with no escort, it had to defend itself. So Junkers armed it to the teeth. The prototypes carried 2 20mm MG-151-20 cannons in power-operated turrets, one mounted overhead and another at the tail. To cover its sides, engineers installed 4 13mm machine guns, 2 on each side of the fuselage. The nose bristled with additional gun mounts, giving it firepower in nearly every direction. A pilot flying near one would feel like they were trying to dogfight a flying battleship through the clouds. And then there was the most dangerous moment of all: takeoff. Fully loaded, the Ju-390 needed ridiculously long runways. If even a single engine failed during the climb, the aircraft could spiral into disaster in seconds. It wasn't just a challenge, it was a gamble every time it left the ground. But once airborne, it was something new. something no other nation in the world had at that time. A true intercontinental bomber. And Germany wasn't content with just one. The prototypes, V1 and V2. For all the terrifying potential written on paper, only a handful of Ju-390s were ever built. And of those, only 2 prototypes, the V1 and the V2, are even seriously discussed by historians. Let's start with the Ju-390 V1. This was the first real, tangible machine. Not just drawings or blueprints, but metal and rivets, engines and wings. Built in Dessau, it took to the skies for the first time on October 20th, 1943. Witnesses described it as an almost alien sight. 6 engines roaring in unison, a fuselage as long as a house, wings that seemed impossibly wide. On the ground, it looked like a steel whale. In the air, it was a slow-moving leviathan.
The V1 was more than a showpiece. It was thoroughly tested, flying regularly out of Prague until early 1944. Incredibly, it was even used to experiment with mid-air refueling, a concept decades ahead of its time. Imagine that. German engineers in the 1940s were already trying to push the limits of endurance, testing whether this giant could stay aloft for thousands of kilometers without ever landing. The project had political importance too. Hitler himself was reportedly shown the V1, a propaganda trophy to prove Germany's technical genius. But in the end, its fate was grim. By April 1945, as Allied forces swept into Germany, the prototype was destroyed at Dessau to prevent it from falling into enemy hands. And then there's the V2. Here's where the story gets murky and controversial. Did it ever actually exist? That question still divides historians to this day. Some sources claim the V2 was completed in June 1944 and first flown that September. Others insist it flew much earlier, possibly in 1943. A German author, Friedrich Georg, even wrote that test pilot Joachim Isermann flew the V2 for 50 minutes over Rechlin on February 9, 1945, citing what he claimed was a logbook entry. Sounds convincing, right? But here's the problem. Another key witness, pilot Hans Panchers, flat out denied it. After the war, he stated clearly that only one Ju-390 ever flew, the V1. According to him, there was no second prototype, no mysterious flight, no V2. So who was telling the truth? Was the V2 completed but destroyed before the Allies captured it? Did it almost fly but never leave the ground? Or was it simply a paper design exaggerated into legend after the war? What is known is that the V2 was intended to be different from its sibling. It wasn't just a test bed. It was designed as a maritime reconnaissance aircraft, equipped with long-range radar and bristling with defensive guns, reportedly up to 5 20mm cannons, depending on the source. If it truly existed, it would have been a formidable scout, prowling the Atlantic and guiding U-boats toward Allied convoys. But the deeper you dig, the more the line between fact and fiction begins to blur. The V1 was real. It flew, it was tested, and it died in flames at the end of the war. The V2? That remains a mystery, a ghost in aviation history, whispered about but never conclusively proven. And yet the legend of the Ju-390 doesn't end there, because while these prototypes were being tested, another story was beginning to circulate, a story far more incredible, and far more controversial. A story that claimed the Ju-390 not only flew across Europe, but crossed the Atlantic itself. The Japanese connection. By 1944, the Ju-390 had already become more than just a German experiment. Its size, range, and terrifying potential caught the attention of another Axis power thousands of kilometers away. Japan had its own aviation ambitions. Japan's war stretched across the Pacific, with vast distances between islands, naval targets, and potential enemies. Long-range bombers were not just useful, they were essential. But Japan faced the same problem Germany did. Creating a reliable intercontinental aircraft was almost impossible with the technology of the day. So, when word of the Ju-390 reached Tokyo, interest was immediate. Here was a plane that seemed capable of achieving what Japanese engineers had been struggling toward for years, a bomber that could leap oceans, strike distant targets, and return home safely. According to reports, in 1944, Japan made its move. A contract was supposedly signed giving the Imperial Army rights to license produce the Ju-390.
The deal was ambitious. Blueprints and technical documents were to be handed over, and Japan intended to adapt the design for its own use. One account even claims that German engineers prepared to deliver these documents to General Otani of the Japanese Army by early 1945. The timing was critical. By this point, the Allies were pressing both Germany and Japan hard, and each nation was desperate for a technological miracle that might change their fortunes. But here's where the story fades into uncertainty. Did Japan ever receive the blueprints? Did the deal ever truly go through? Most historians agree that if a contract was signed, it was too late. The war's tide had turned, and the window for transferring such massive technical projects had closed. By February 1945, Germany itself was crumbling under Allied bombardment. Factories were being overrun, and fuel shortages made even existing aircraft nearly useless. Delivering a complete set of blueprints to Japan across war-torn seas was nearly impossible. Still, the idea of a Japanese Ju-390 is chilling. Imagine for a moment if the design had been successfully transferred. Japan could have produced its own intercontinental bombers, capable of striking Hawaii, Australia, or even the American West Coast. The psychological shock would have been immense, and the Pacific War could have unfolded in ways we can barely imagine. But the truth is simpler and more sobering. The deal, if it ever existed, never materialized. The war ended before Japan could lay its hands on a working Ju-390 design. What remains is just another tantalizing what-if of World War II, a shadow of a possibility that never had the chance to take flight. Yet the story of the Ju-390 wasn't done there, because while the Japanese contract may have vanished into the fog of war, another rumor was beginning to spread. A rumor far more incredible. A story that, if true, would have shaken the United States to its core.
The story goes that this giant bomber crossed the frigid Atlantic, flew within 12 miles of New York City, snapped aerial photographs of the skyline, and then turned back, making the return flight to Europe without detection. A Nazi warplane hovering at the doorstep of America's greatest city before disappearing into the clouds. If true, it would have been a staggering achievement and a terrifying warning shot. Imagine waking up in 1944 to learn that a German bomber had flown undetected over New York. The panic alone could have reshaped U.S. strategy, forcing America to spend vast resources defending its cities rather than focusing on Europe. But here's the problem. There's no evidence. The claim first appeared more than a decade after the war, in 1955, when British aviation journalist William Green wrote about it. He cited supposed British intelligence reports that mentioned testimony from German POWs. According to them, a U-390 had indeed reached American shores. Sounds dramatic, but when historians started digging, things quickly fell apart. No photographs from the alleged mission have ever surfaced. Not a single aerial shot of New York from a U-390 has been found. No Allied radar logs record such a flight. For an aircraft that massive, it should have left some trace. Most damning of all, pilot Hans Panchertz's flight logs show that the V-1 prototype wasn't even in France at the time. It was in Prague, far from any possible Atlantic mission. Could it have been the mysterious V-2 prototype? Maybe, but its very existence remains disputed. If it wasn't proven to exist, then it certainly wasn't crossing the Atlantic in January 1944. So why does this story persist? One theory is psychological warfare. In wartime, fear can be as powerful as bombs. Imagine how effective it would have been to spread rumors that German bombers could appear over American cities, unseen and unstoppable. Even if the flight never happened, the mere possibility could have shaken public confidence and forced the U.S. military to divert resources to homeland defense. And that may have been the true purpose of the story. A legend seeded into the post-war years, designed to magnify the U-390's mystique and reinforce the idea that Germany had almost reached across the Atlantic. Still, despite all the evidence against it, the rumor refuses to die. To this day, you can find aviation enthusiasts arguing online, asking, what if it really happened? What if just once a U-390 did make it to New York? Fact, fiction, or propaganda weaponized into myth? The truth is probably simpler, but to understand why, we need to look at what happened to the U-390 project as the war dragged on. The reality check. By the summer of 1944, The dream of the Amerika Bomber was already dead. The truth was simple. Germany no longer had the means to chase fantasies. The Luftwaffe had lost air superiority over Europe. Allied bombers were hammering German cities day and night. Oil fields in Romania were under siege, and fuel shortages were crippling every branch of the Wehrmacht. Even the most advanced aircraft in the world were useless if there wasn't enough fuel to keep them in the air. Every drop of fuel, every hour of factory time, every mechanic's wrench had to go toward survival, not global dreams. In that reality, the U-390, with its 6 thirsty engines and gigantic wings, was more of a liability than a weapon. The Luftwaffe couldn't afford to waste scarce resources on experimental giants when it desperately needed nimble fighters to defend German skies. Every drop of fuel, every hour of factory time, every mechanic's wrench had to go toward survival, not global dreams. The V-1 prototype had flown, had been tested, and had proven that intercontinental flight was at least technically possible. But it never dropped a bomb, never carried out an operational mission, never changed the course of the war. By April 1945, it was destroyed in Dessau, reduced to twisted wreckage before Allied troops could capture it. The V-2, if it ever existed, never reached service. It faded into rumor, speculation, and post-war debate. And so the U-390 became one more entry in the long list of Nazi wonder weapons, bold, bizarre projects that dazzled on paper but were doomed in practice. Like the jet-powered flying wings, the rocket interceptors, and the monstrous tanks, it represented a regime grasping for miracles while reality closed in. The legend, though, outlived the plane itself. The supposed New York mission still circulates, whispered about in aviation books, documentaries, and late-night debates. For some, it's proof of German genius. For others, just another propaganda trick. But the reality is sobering. The U-390 never bombed New York, never threatened America, and never changed history. It was a giant that flew, but only as a prototype. A machine that carried with it the ambitions of a collapsing empire, a symbol of how desperation can fuel impossible dreams. And yet that legend endures, because sometimes the myth of what might have been is more powerful than the truth of what was.